Embroidery files have a lot of different properties associated with them, but one of the most visible ones to both you and your customer is probably stitch type. And stitch type has a lot of impact on the look of your design, how sculptural it is, how the light catches the thread. So let's look at the stitch type property and see what kind of impact that can have on your design. So first off, I have just a couple bits of lettering here. Now, not all stitch types are applicable to lettering. Some will look really, really funny, but it's kind of a handy way for us to get kind of a handle on what these stitch types are. So let's take a look. Stitch types available in this drop-down, and then available through properties as well. Now, if you've got lettering, you'll need to go down to the top stitching group to see this property. So where I'm looking is either right here on the property bar or right here in the properties window. So to kind of clean up my screen and get a little more real estate so that we have a little more room to work, I'm going to close my object properties window, and I'm going to deal mostly with this drop down here just so that you can see these changes on screen. And I'm probably going to do both of these just to give you what it would look like. I've got just kind of a nice clean sans serif. It's deco block. The one below it is Artemis script, so you've got it in this very clean geometric shape, and then below it you've got this very calligraphic flowing shape, so we can see how these stitches kind of play along that. And the first stitch type that I want to talk about is a satin stitch, and that's what it is selected right now. They're very rounded, they're very shiny, they're very sculptural. They tend to stay up out of the fabric a little more. They also can save on your stitch count because you're not sinking stitches within the form. They stay up out of the form a little bit more, and so you can really get a good amount of definition. Lettering, typically when people are looking at lettering, they're thinking in their head satin stitch, whether they know that or not. That's typically what they're thinking. So definitely a handy thing for that. It does have a little bit of a limited range. Typically you're going to be using satin stitches between 10 points and 60 or 70 points. So 1 millimeter or 6 or 7 millimeters. With satin stitches, because they stay up out of the fabric so much, they can snag and pull out if they get a little bit too long. So I give you that range as kind of a guideline. If it's going on a pillow that's going to sit in a formal living room that's never going to be touched, you can get away with a much longer satin stitch. If it's going on the back of a work jacket that's going to get beat up and thrown in the back of a truck and rubbed up against a wall or whatever, you might need to shrink that down. And when things get a little bit too long, you might need to think about switching your stitch type. Another nice thing about this satin stitch is I'm going to take this out of 3D so that we can see the direction of the stitches a little bit. I'm going to come in. They tend to go across the form, so again that gives that a little bit more dimension. Typically they will change direction throughout the shape, so you see that here as it is changing direction throughout the form, but you can really see it in these curvilinear shapes where you see that your stitch direction here is coming this way and then coming across this way, and then all of these are kind of coming across this way, so you get a nice sense of movement with your stitches. All right. They typically run perpendicular to the edge across the form and again change direction throughout that form. So all things to keep in mind. Now, I said just a few moments ago, if your stitches are getting a little bit longer, they can snag and pull out, and you may want to have a different stitch type. One of the better stitch types for those kind of heavy duty jobs where you want the stitches to stay a little bit closer to the fabric and be a little bit more durable would be a fill stitch, and a fill stitch is going to sink needle penetrations through the form, so those stitches are going to sink down in a little bit more. It's going to give it a little bit less dimension. It will be a little bit flatter of a look, or at least it can be. There are ways to kind of help that out a little bit. But it definitely does become a little more durable. It is a little bit flatter looking typically. Typically they're meant for larger areas. So I have a big fill across the back of a design where it's going to be filled in with a lot of color. Typically that's going to be using a fill stitch. Now, because it sinks stitches within the form, your stitch count can go a little bit higher. So keep that in mind as you're working on it. But let's take a look at the difference in these. So right now I've got a satin stitch, and as I change this to a fill stitch and hit apply, you can see that I'm starting to sink stitches within that form. So if we zoom in here on this L, you can see that those needle penetrations are starting to sink in. It does look a little bit flatter. Now, by default, anywhere that it gets really, really thin, it will start to come back to being a satin stitch, just for a few reasons. One, you want to save a little bit of your stitch count. Two, if you start sinking stitches within a small shape, your stitches are going to be very, very small and could possibly be a thread break. So when we start sinking below that 2 millimeter line or that 20-point line, typically we become a satin stitch to avoid those really tiny stitches and give you a much smoother sew out. All right. I am going to turn off the underlay for the rest of these because you're really going to notice what's underneath when I start changing these stitch types. And now I'm going to change from a fill, I'm going to go down to a zigzag. This is definitely one of those stitch types that's not typically meant for lettering. Yeah, no, looks kind of funny as lettering. What is a zigzag stitch typically used for? Well, most often it is used as a tack down for an applique. Occasionally it will be used when we start talking about underlay, you'll hear me talk about zigzag as an underlay stitch, but as top stitching, just like this, it is either going to be mostly a decorative stitch, or you may see it as a tack down around the outside edge of another piece of material that's being appliqued or tacked down to your garment. Definitely some decorative aspects to it that you can highlight and use, but often not your standard top stitching. I'm going to skip down just a bit in my stitch type, and I'm going to go to tackle. And tackle and zigzag are very, very, very similar. The biggest difference is the default density. So kind of all the same rules apply. Not typically your normal top stitching. Not typically just something that you see unless it's being used in a very decorative sense or as the outside edge of an applique. And in looking at this, you may be wondering, okay, you've shown me satin stitches, you've shown me zigzag, you've shown me tackle. I'm not seeing a lot of difference other than the density. And with tackle and zigzag, that's really, really true. But with the difference between satin stitches and those other two, the zigzag and the tackle, the difference is a little subtle, but it's definitely there. Let's maybe duplicate this and take a look at how those two apply. All right, so I'm going to duplicate this lettering. I'm just going to press Control D on my keyboard to duplicate it. So now I have two. I'm going to change the color of this. Let's do blue, and I'm going to do the first one as red. The first one I'm going to make a satin stitch. Now by default, that satin stitch is going to have some pretty tight density. So I'm going to turn that density kind of down, and I will make it match the zigzag. So I think that's a 17. All right, and then I'm going to grab the blue and I'm going to change that to a zigzag. I lied, it's a 25. Let me go back and fix that. All right, so now I've got the red as a satin stitch with a 25 point density and the blue as a zigzag with a 20 point density. So let me zoom in here. You can see them overlapped. Now I'm going to just drag this off to the side just slightly so you can see them side by side. The big difference in this is that with a satin stitch, which is the red, you're going to step across the form, get a full stitch, and then step down. Step across the form, get a full stitch, then step down. With a zigzag, you will step every time you move. So you never get that kind of right angle, completely perpendicular edge. So that's going to be your big difference between those two. Satin stitches go across the form, then step, across the form, then step, whereas a zigzag steps every time. That's kind of the big difference. All right, let's take a look at a different type of stitch. This one also not really meant for lettering. Let's take this down and let's look at an E stitch. Those of you who are familiar with sewing in other aspects will maybe know its kind of other name or a similar type of application known as a blanket stitch. And so what happens typically with this, and again, really weird as lettering, but if I look at this O, other than my travel stitch, you're starting to see the real application for it. And what this typically is it's another decorative-ish, very applicable to the outside edge of another piece of material. So with a blanket stitch, it goes around the outside edge and jumps to come in, outside edge jumps to come in. Same thing here. Typically this is used as a tack down for an applique. Oftentimes it is used alone as a very decorative element of that and is not covered up. But the idea being that you travel around the outside edge of it and don't shift the material very much, and then you jump in to tack it down. So that's what this is often used for, but don't count it out as another type of decorative element. I have top stitched over satin stitches with it for in a different color to give it kind of a different look. I did it for a design that I was doing where I had a sweatshirt with a cuff. In the design, I think it was a mascot, a school mascot or something, was wearing one of the school's, I guess it wasn't a sweatshirt, it was a letter jacket, but it had that kind of ribbing on the cuff. Well, for my detail, I just grabbed an E-stitch and went around the edge of it, and it jumped in and tacked everything down, outlined it, gave me the ribbing, all of that, and I had to do very little work. I could also very easily see it as very decorative eyelashes for a design like that, where you have a very simplified face with kind of those eyelashes. And as we look at this, you can see how on the C, if I were to invert that a little bit, you can see how that might be applied. All right, so that's the E stitch. Let's take a look at another one. This one, again, and I know I keep saying this a lot, not really meant for lettering, but it is an edge fill. And edge fills, especially when you're dealing with kind of the thicks and thins, the script down below looking a little weird, the block up above is actually not doing too poorly. There are a couple pieces I would want to tweak, but what this does is it runs a fill stitch, but it runs parallel with the edge. So this can be used to achieve some kind of wood grain effects. Again, a little bit dodgy when you're dealing with lettering, especially with a bunch of thick and thin, but you can use it to achieve some interesting shading effects. You can use it to achieve kind of some wood paneling effects or wood grain effects, those types of things. So I said it's a little dodgy with some lettering, but take a look at what can happen. So I'll just digitize this. When you have a piece that has some really interesting thick, thin shapes, but you are in control. So I've got this piece here. As I change this to an edge fill, and let's take that underlay off so we're not seeing all the pieces underneath, you can definitely start to get some interesting shading effects. And as it goes around, you really get some interesting contours with it. So edge fill, sink stitches within the form, stitches run parallel to the edge, but not so applicable to lettering, can give you some really interesting shapes. I like it for fur effects or with contour, so a nice muscle definition occasionally. You can do a lot of things with that. All right, let's change out of that. And then now we're just getting into things that are absolutely crazy for me to have lettering up here for. So I'm just going to change this to a walk so that you can see what those other stitch types are. And mostly that's going to be a decorative. So that allows you to have a pattern that follows along a form. And you can choose what pattern you want from this drop down. Or a sequin allows you, if you have a sequin attachment, to create sequins with it. Those are the majority of your stitch types. You can create a lot of definition in your design with those stitch types. You also have the option when you're digitizing, if it's a little overwhelming, when do I use a satin, when do I use a fill? Typically use a satin for smaller pieces, give it a little more dimension. Typically use a fill for larger areas. If that's overwhelming, you do have the ability when you are digitizing, when you're creating lettering, or when you're even converting artwork, to choose to have it to be an auto stitch type. So let's look at that with some lettering. So I'm going to just type in Melco here real quick again. And if I look at this property under top stitching, there is a checkbox for auto right beside stitch type. What this does, and anytime you see this box with the 3 dots, if I click on it, it's going to give me the properties of it. Very huge on my screen. Let's see if I can bring this down to something a little more manageable for you guys. This is kind of going to give me my ranges for auto. So for small objects, which is going to have a range between 0 and 60 points, so kind of on the smaller side of things, nothing to 6 millimeters, you are going to be using a satin stitch with an auto density, which we'll talk about when we deal with density. Nice if it gets really, really large. So if it starts to occasionally go above that, it will start to sink stitches within the form so that it doesn't snag and pull out. When I start dealing with larger elements that average above 60 points, so these are the average ranges, and then here are kind of specific areas. So on the top, we're dealing with an overall average range. At the overall size of the design, or element, sorry, if the overall size of the element is less than 60 points, it'll be a satin stitch. If it occasionally goes over, but it still averages less than 60 points, where it occasionally goes over, it will start sinking stitches within the form in a random patternless fill with a 50-point stitch length. That's going to sink those stitches within that form and give you still a very satiny look, but keep those stitches within the form and keep them in the fabric a little bit better. And then when you start dealing with larger objects, so let's take a look at that large object size. If they average 60 points or more, then it will use a fill stitch with a standard step fill. Don't have what I thought I had selected, so a standard step fill, a stitch length of 40. Here's all that kind of fill partition sequence, which is basically like the brick pattern that the stitches make, with your density here. But here, if you use, this is where things, if you start having areas that fall below 20 points, it will be that satin stitch. That's where we start giving you satin stitches where it gets really, really thin, so we're not sinking in really, really tiny stitches and giving you thread breaks. So auto stitch type, as you scale it, it will change the stitch type based on how big your element is, but it will swap between a satin and a fill for you as needed. Makes your designs a little more scalable, and if you're just not comfortable making some of those decisions on which type it should be, then this auto stitch type will definitely help you out with that. Just remember that your stitch types are going to give you a lot of dimension in your designs and give you a lot of artistic license with how the light hits your thread and how your designs really show in the real world. So take a look at them and enjoy the different types of stitches that you have in your software and can sew out.